He's one of a fairly small number of economists who can fairly claim that they laid the foundation for current employment and training policies in our country, although he may disavow that in his talk. In the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the federal government began to assume a far more active role in the development of the nation's human resources than it had previously played. In those pre-politically correct days, we used to refer to it as manpower, not human resources. And two of the acts which were passed to increase the federal role were the Manpower Development and Training Act and the Vocational Education Act of 1963, which fundamentally changed our field. During that period, Dr. Mangum served as research director for the Senate Subcommittee on Employment and Manpower and as executive director of the President's Committee on Manpower. He was one of the originators of the National Council on Employment Policy, served that council as its chair, and is currently its secretary-treasurer. He was a co-founder with Sar Levitan of the Center for Social Policy Studies at George Washington University and is currently a fellow of the Sar Levitan Center for Social Policy at Johns Hopkins University. During most of this period, Dr. Mangum's academic home was the University of Utah, where he still holds the title of Max McGraw Professor of Economics Emeritus, of Economics and Management Emeritus. He also served as director of the Institute for Human Resource Management at the University of Utah. While serving in all these roles, he found time to write over 60 books and monographs and numerous articles on labor relations, workforce development, and poverty, and also served as arbitrator of over 600 labor management relation disputes. We feel very fortunate that Dr. Mangum has agreed to share his observations on the Workforce Investment Act, the current version of the legislation that had its origins in the Manpower and Development Training Act of 1962. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mangum to the Center.
And Morgan, I didn't ask you one crucial question. How long is this thing supposed to last?
As long as you like.
No, that's not it.
At 4:30.
At 4:30, all right. Well, I won't talk that long, but we'll hope that all of you will. This is a real pleasure to be here for lots and lots of reasons. Hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. For lots and lots of reasons, I suppose the really prime one is to come to this town, my wife and I, last night, and have a little three-year-old granddaughter throw her arms around us, and just after about a year or something like that. I should tell you, you're being invited here by the College of Business, our son Steve, who is the associate dean at that college, and that, of course, brings us here to see 5 grandchildren whenever we can possibly make it. Well, at any rate, I've written a piece of paper that sat down with the computer the other night and wrote through what I would like to say, and therefore, whether I say it or not, you've got it in your hands, and that's the official record. It's just like the minutes at a meeting. It doesn't matter what really goes on. What those minutes say is, of course, what is going to go down for history from then on. So, the important points I'd like to talk about a little bit. I have called this, you'll note, the Requiem of employment and training programs, and therefore I quickly had to explain at the beginning that I have not lost my 40-year advocacy of this type of program. It's just that the world in which we live and the world in which we work continually changes over the years, and there comes a time when something that works quite well at an earlier point has some very real problems existing here. And therefore, I put a little anecdote in there, if you'll pardon me, but at my age, you know more anecdotes than remembrances than you do about courage.
I'm not getting on the video.
Oh, that's what you need. Okay, well, in that case, I'll get more stationary for the point. At any rate, I wrote down there in my memory that that in 1943, I walked across the graduation stage, as most everybody does once in a while. But at my era, of course, that was fairly unique. That put me in the top 25%, because 75% at that point didn't bother. Actually, in 1940, 30% graduated from high school. But by 1943, of course, because the war was on and people were dispersed much more rapidly, only 25% were graduating. And the point of that was that, though that may have seemed like an accomplishment to those of us who did, it was by no means necessary, and that, in fact, there were plenty of people who thought that was a waste of time. And I pointed out that not only were all those Army and Navy and military recruiters and the draft board out there, but there was so much work going on in our community particularly. There was a steel plant being built, and being built in that particular location because of the fear that there might be an invasion from Japan, at least the time they started the production. And so immediately at the end of high school, I signed on with the Army Air Force, signing up at 17, with them to call me up at 18. And in between, I went to work on helping build that steel plant on construction, and very briefly went on to production when the steel plant opened. And that gave me recall rights. So when I came back from the service, I went to work there, and I stayed briefly and went on to other things. But the point is that those of my friends and relatives who stayed at that plant, most of whom had never graduated from high school, but they had very successful careers, were well paid, and 40 years or so later ended up with nice, comfortable pensions. Steve has an uncle who's in that category, and a number of others. Well, try that today is the point. So as the years go by, those requirements change. Now, in that context, you put the Manpower Development Training Act and the Concentrated Employment and Training Act and so forth, and watch its progress from the 60s, as Morgan was saying. Federal government begins to play different roles. Well, the vocational education, we had the Smith-Hughes Act from 1917, which meant that the federal government gave the states some matching grants to encourage them to do vocational education, but of course in a very different way than you do it at this point. But what was introduced anew in the 1960s was what I've called in some publications second chance programs. The idea of vocational education initially, of course, would be that as you went through high school, you could get some training, initially in vocational agriculture and home economics and trades and industries, and that was it. And then you began to move up to the more modern kinds of things. But in the 60s, because we became concerned about technological displacement, and then we also looked around and found, I put a little personal thing in there. After I left that steel plant, I was later a coal miner and a lot of other things. So I used to joke when I came to Washington in the 60s that I was the only living evidence that a coal miner could be retrained. Now, I had gone to the Brigham Young University and Harvard University to get that retraining, but that was also not unusual. When the Economic Opportunity Act was introduced, and with the Job Corps as part of it, I remember in a congressional hearing when the new director of Job Corps was kind of attacked by a senator in that hearings about the very high cost of the Job Corps, and the senator said, "Why, I could send my son to Harvard for less than you're costing for these Job Corps kids." And the response was, "Well, if you'll get one of these kids into Harvard, I'll gladly personally pay his tuition to get him there." Well, so the point. We were looking at two kinds of people, the ones who were entering the labor force inadequately trained, and those who were in the labor force and becoming displaced. And so that the Manpower Development Training Act, and then subsequently the CETA and JTPA, and now the Workforce Investment Act going on from there. The First Amendment to the Manpower Development and Training Act, which was really my first assignment in the congressional staff position, was to add to the MDTA extra weeks of training to allow an addition of remedial basic education to it. We started out with the idea, well, let's take these displaced workers and we'll send them to training, but we found out that you might be able to mine coal without knowing how to read and write, but it was pretty hard even then to become a machinist without being able to read and write, so you're going to have basic education added to that. And incidentally, as all of you have had the experience before, we learned very quickly that you couldn't separate them. You couldn't put somebody in basic education and get that done and then move on to the skill training, because you couldn't get adults to take the basic education seriously unless you intermingled it with the skill training so that they recognized the interrelationships and the essentiality of that. Well, but the point is that 6 or 8 months of retraining, combination of basic skill training and or basic education and skill training, was enough to get people back on the road and employed, particularly after the Vietnam came along and the unemployment rates went down and the demand for skills was greater, then people were making an easy transition. Now, see, I hope that won't fall. That brings me then to the first table, and there's nothing in there new to all of you. And I just happened, I'll confess, that I was discriminatory, and that was just that in front of me as I was writing, I could very easily pull up this chart number 1, and it just happened to be male only. But just to illustrate the point that looking as of today, look at the difference of incomes between high school dropouts and master's degree and higher. And you all know the data, that from the early 70s up to today, it's been that status. That the only way you can even maintain your real standard of living is by having a bachelor's degree at least. And the only way on the average of increasing it over those years is to have post-secondary work, because the gains in the earnings on the average have been less than the impact of price changes, standard of living or costs over the years. So if you don't have substantial education and training, you aren't going anywhere. We keep telling people in our state, where, unlike yours, the average wage, occupation by occupation, is 16% below the national average, is that the only way in the world you're going to stay out of poverty is either get lots of education and training or have more than one earner per family. You just can't cut it otherwise and produce yourself a family-sustaining earning. So that's what you're competing with. And then you began to look at what was happening to MDTA and CETA and JTPA. Now, the data I have here, of course, is all from JTPA, more recent developments in time, but these things were happening gradually over those many years. Now, first, notice how small JTPA had become. There was, in this particular year, 1997, only 265,000 people terminated out of Title IIA. Now, remember, that's the disadvantaged worker title. You've got Title IIB and C, which were for youth, and Title III, which was for displaced workers. But for those people who had poverty incomes and now want a second chance getting themselves prepared to get into the labor market and doing better for themselves, there was only, out of whole United States, 265,000 who terminated from Title IIA that year. That doesn't mean they were trained. That means that people who had enrolled at one time or another happened to terminate in that year, and as we'll see in a minute, some of them went out with very little training, but in total, 265,000. Well, if you look at the eligibility, who was eligible for JTPA Title IIA, over 26,000 people were eligible for that training, but Congress appropriated enough money to train about 1% of all the people who were eligible for that program. And you can see by gender and by age how that was differentiated. And later on I have the dollars of reasons for that. But turn over now to Table 2 and look at the nature of change. In a parenthesis up there I say that I can't, at the time I was writing this, I couldn't see why the difference between the 265,000 people, terminees in Table 1 and only 200,000 here in Table 2. But I actually recognized subsequently, it was on the plane in here yesterday rereading this, that I realized that there is another category that I didn't put in here. And that other category is objective assessment only. So a lot of people ended up in JTPA just simply being enrolled and going through an assessment process with absolutely zero training. And that's where the disappearing 60,000 or never got any training at all of any kind. They just got assessed and then didn't choose to go on into training. Now, of those who were trained, you look down that number of terminees and see what's happened, and look particularly at percent of total. Only 47% of those were clearly into occupational skills, classroom occupational skills. There is a trainings combination category, and some of those would have gotten occupational skills in addition to something else. I have no idea what the numbers are. But what we really end up saying is that about half of the enrollees actually got some significant amount of occupational skill training. Now, OJT, on-the-job training. Well, unfortunately, on-the-job training under MBTA and CETA and JTPA was always you were buying a job. You weren't necessarily getting any training. It was a subsidized program in which employers who would hire eligible people got 50% of the wage for the first 500 hours. And there was no way of checking and making sure that people actually got training. Some place may have actually checked it up, but by and large, you just simply hired eligible people, and then you got the subsidy for that time. So there's no reason to think that significant amounts of actual training took place, though certainly it was worthwhile most of the time to pay an employer to hire somebody that he might not otherwise have been hired and put them to work, and they're likely to stay, and so it's going to be helpful. But it shouldn't be seen as the same as occupational skill training. So first, what we're going to see is relatively few people were getting significant amounts of occupational skill training. The Table 3 is just to show how that was distributed, and it shouldn't surprise you any to see that the more previous preparation they had they graduated from high school, and how good were they in math are essentially the two things that we've got down here. How much previous educational attainment and how much math capability. And you can see that the more previous education you had and the better your math capabilities, the more likely you were to get occupational skill training as contrasted to some of the other forms of training. Basic skills only, well, that's fine. Those people who got it, you can guess really needed it, but in terms of preparation for actual employment may not have been all of that great. And then Table 4, and this is what I think is really crucial for us to recognize. Most of you are involved in some way or another of what we used to call vocational training. It's now career and technical training, and that I think it's an appropriate change of title. But notice here, total hours of training, and compare that with the wage in that first job at the time of termination, and the wage later on. And the first set of three is all of these JTPA Title IIA people, whether they got occupational skill training or not. And the third set of three columns is just looking at those who at the occupational skill training by themselves. And as you begin to look at the wage, only when you get up above 1,200 hours of training do you find that on the average, now it's not there wouldn't have been somebody with higher wages, but on the average, people with 1,200 hours and above were getting $7.50 to $8 an hour. $8 an hour, 2,000 hours a year, so we're talking about $16,000, which is roughly the poverty rate for, right between the poverty rate for a family of three and family of four, as we'll see in just a minute. Well, at any rate, that's great. People who got substantial number of hours got something close to kind of the beginnings of a family sustaining wage. But look at what proportion that was. If you look over here at the occupational skill training hours, that's about 5%, just a little more if you look at the entire group. Such a very small percentage got those substantial number of hours, and those substantial number of hours were highly correlated with decent, or at least the beginnings of decent wages. Now, I got the numbers down, the budget numbers down there in that next paragraph below Table 4, just to show you how things went. At CETA, the skill training part peaked at $9 billion at the end of the Ford administration, stayed roughly that level through the Carter administration, dropped very drastically through the Reagan and first Bush years, came back a little during the Clinton, but even then, roughly 5 million, 5 billion. Take out your pen on page 4, slowly back to 5. When I was Senate staffer, what was the old guy's name that was from Illinois, senator from Illinois? Dirksen. He used to say, a billion here and a billion there, and the first thing you know, it gets to be real money. But really, I was working there in the Johnson administration, where for the first time, we had a federal budget of $100 billion. If you can imagine that. Now that's in one lifetime. What is it today? Well, we're talking about cutting taxes by 1.6 trillion, and let alone what we're doing with budgets and things of that sort. So anyway, but at least we had $1 billion that we had at the end of JTPA's life, and workforce investment is starting out with less than the JTPA, as we'll see. Now, I've put in a little paragraph at the bottom of page 4 that it's very important for me to have there, because I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this was not a worthwhile investment. I've got a lot of my life committed to MDTA and CETA and JTPA, and as many of you have. And I think we did some very worthwhile things. It was very worth doing while we were doing it. There's been a lot of criticism subsequently in terms of the evaluations that have been done, and you've heard over and over and over that the men enrollees did not have wage gains that were statistically significant above the control group, that women's wage gains did increase enough to be statistically significant. But take a look at what we're talking about when we say statistically significant, and compare the costs of training to the increases. Now that $536 for men and $540 for women. That's an annual earnings increase. And then if you look at what the average training costs, averaged over all these people, dropouts and everybody, the average costs were $670 for men and $860 for women. That says that in 1 year you got yourself a 54% return on one, 96% return on others. So if they kept that up for 2 years, you got your money back in that situation. And I'm citing, didn't put the footnote in there, but James Heckman did an article in a book that Steve and I co-authored here a few years ago, James Heckman from the University of Chicago, and he cited as the rate of return to employer on-the-job employer investments in training at it being about 10%. So obviously JTPA for its CETA was paying off better than what the employers were spending on their incumbent worker training. So it wasn't bad. Question is, what do we got to have for here on out? And then I've added in here this question of criteria. Steve, would you? One of the things I've been saying a lot about recently and feel fairly strongly about is the question of everything being tied to the poverty rate. Now, we keep saying you're eligible for this if you're have an income below the poverty threshold or something of that sort. Co-authored this recently. Poverty ain't what it used to be. And I think it's important that we all recognize that when we say poverty. So look at that table on page 4. If you put the poverty rate back where it was in 1964, I was there when that was decided upon. The original, during the war on poverty, got to set a poverty line. How are you going to define it? What is poverty? All that was done was taking the data that said that the average family spends 1/3 of its income on food. Not the poverty family, not the poor, but on the average across the board at 1964, people were spending 1/3 of their income on food. Well, there was and how much food do people eat? Well, this is 1964, but there was a 1955 study that the Department of Agriculture had made showing what the food menu would have to be. What did a family have to be a life-sustaining menu, in effect? Well, then we took the cost of that and tripled it and said that's the poverty line. And, of course, it was roughly $3,000 for the family of 4 and the whole range. And then from then on, what we've done in this country, we've never made that study again. All we've done from that time on is just keep snudging it up by the current population, the CPI, the cost of living index. Well, what's happened over time? Well, housing, which used to be 25%, is now snudging up against 50%, and food, which used to be 1/3, is down low on that. So if you redo the whole thing, well, what I've said here in the text, if, in the first place, if you took the income, the standard of living as it existed in 1964, the quality of the housing and how much you ate, food, shelter, clothing, and the whole thing, you'd have to up the poverty rate by 40%. It would have to be 140%. But it also happened in 1964, it wasn't deliberately done that way, but it ought to have been, that the poverty threshold as established in 1964 was 50% of the household median income in the United States. If we had stayed with that median income, you'd have to have 165% of the current poverty threshold to equal 50% of our median income. And that would have given it this progression. Well, for this table, I just fell down between those two and took 150% just to show you what you'd have to have today if you're thinking in terms of a family-sustaining income. Even 1964, I'd hated to sustain a family at the poverty level, but even at that, you see what you'd end up. If your family size is very small, not bad. You don't have to have an awful lot of hours pay if you're single to reach 150% of the present poverty rate. But if you happen to be trying to feed 4 people, you, your spouse, and 2 others, then you'd have to have nearly $13 an hour just to reach that 50% of the median income in essence, as you can see, and so on up through that. And since most of us have more than one earner, I've chosen to just say, well, but suppose somebody in the family is working half-time at the federal minimum wage, and the other person is working full-time. How much does the person full-time have to make? Well, anyway, I'd suggest comparing that back to the fact that after these 1,200 hours of training on the average, you end up making about $8 an hour, and see where you really stand. That'd be 2 of you at this point. So just thinking about where you have to get and help people to find their way to if you're thinking in terms of family-sustaining earnings. Well, let's see, what else do I need to draw out of that? Oh, okay. Now let's turn back to the Workforce Investment Act. I was very critical of it at first. Wrote something in which I criticized it as being the Training as Last Resort Act, and it certainly is. I was pleased to sit out in the lobby out here and read that your senator here says exactly the same thing. It is training as last resort, so I'm not being all that harsh. But, of course, that's what the Act says. It says that you've got money going in 3 different directions. You've got a youth program, and the money going to youth, I'm not saying much about it here today, but let me say right off, I think that the youth portion of the Workforce Investment Act is highly admirable, credible. It has great potential. It recognizes a lot of things that JTPA or none of those previously did, sets up these separate youth councils, puts these 10 principles as guides to what's a workable youth program. The old JTPA and CETA and MDTA programs were criticized because they didn't do much for youth. Well, what did they do? They provided some summertime employment, and sometimes for some after-school employment. The average duration of training in those programs under JTPA and CETA was 15 hours a week, and what are you going to expect out of all that? But this, I think, is admirable. We don't know what it'll produce yet because it's new, but watch it. I think it's going to do some very useful and some very interesting things. The displaced worker component of JTPA has largely been carried over to WIA, and now has about 50% more money in the displaced worker side than they have in the what is no longer the disadvantaged worker. It's just simply the adult component, because that limitation to low-income people, which began at the end of MDTA, continued through CETA and JTPA, has now been deleted. So all adults are available for their cut at that $950 million, which is the adult component of the Workforce Investment Act. There is language in there that says if it comes to a choice between the competitively disadvantaged and the rest, then the disadvantaged would have priority. But the definitions of who is eligible, if we were only serving 1% of the eligibles under JTPA, the proportion of the eligibles today that can be served under WIA is infinitesimal because everybody is eligible. And then, of course, it says that first you enroll people in what it calls core services, and those core services are listed in the Act, and essentially it's what every public employment service worthy of the name has always done, just simple, straightforward enrollment and referral out to jobs and so forth. Then it says if they can't find suitable employment through core services, then they can have intensive services. And there's a list in the Act of what the intensive services are. And once again, they are essentially the services that all you people are accustomed to, that every vocational counselor. Do you call them vocational counselors now, or do they have to be career and technical counselors? All right. What career and technical counselors would do, that's the intensive services. Then, if and only if they can't find any job of any kind, the way the Act is written, they can then go on into training. But if they can find any job, the way it's written, if McDonald's has got a spot for them, then they can't be trained because they can go to work there. Now, the Labor Department apparently has figured out that that is not livable, and I don't know. I'm sure they didn't do this without checking with somebody in Congress, because they have inserted the word suitable, and so that they don't have suitable employment things out. Now, in our state, the way they're doing that is saying if they can find a job at 125% of the BLS lower living standard or above, then they're not eligible for WIA. But if it's below, then they are eligible, and I hope that they can live with that. But at any rate, very few dollars, relatively little training, and training only as some kind of a last resort. Well, then with that, why do I say, well, that's still something worth having around? Well, because it can contribute to a useful program. Title V of the Workforce Investment Act talks about a unified, what's the word? Unified's the word, but unified council, unified something, right? I got it written here. Don't expect old man to remember every word. If you see Title V there on page 7, you can probably see what the real word is. But at any rate, the Workforce Investment Act does, in fact, encourage agencies in the community to get together and operate in some kind of a coordinated fashion. Now, we've always had job training coordinating councils, and we've had the private industry councils and all of that. Most of the agencies served on that. Your Department of Labor, or its equivalent, was usually the key operator of JTPA or CETA, and then would have this advisory council in which the education folks would be represented, and the employers and the labor organizations would be represented, and vocational rehabilitation might be represented, and so forth. But they were there to advise the Labor Department or the Employment Service, our state, which is called the Department of Workforce Services, whatever you may call it here. They're there on that council to advise the one who has the responsibility. They're not there feeling any responsibility themselves. It's also true that by and large, even though a labor and employment-oriented agency has had the primary responsibility for these second chance skill training programs, they didn't do the training. Our Department of Workforce Services certainly doesn't conduct any training. They enroll people, have enrolled them in JTPA, CETA, and so on. What do? Well, of course, they refer them to the community college or to the applied technology centers or the other institutions run by, in our state, either by the Board of Regents, which is higher education, and the State Board of Education, which has up to secondary. And if you don't think they fight over who should have what at this interchange area between the high school and the post-secondary level. At any rate, so the training has been either purchased from public education, in effect, or private proprietary schools to a smaller degree. Well, now this comes as something else into the picture. If we're going to train longer, and that's what I'm talking about here, if you're going to train people to end up with at a family-sustaining wage, they've obviously got to be trained longer than ever was the case in these second chance programs, MDTA and CETA and JTPA. Under MDTA and CETA, we had subsistence payments. Under MDTA, the adult enrollee got the average level of unemployment compensation plus an extra, I think it was $10 a week, because you're going to have to take the bus to the training facility or something like that. You're going to have a little extra cost. Under CETA, they got the minimum wage. They got better in the minimum wage because it was calculated to the minimum wage because it was a stipend rather than the wage. You didn't have FICA taken out and all that kind of stuff. So we used to joke about who wants to finish training because you got paid better while you were in training than you're going to get afterwards. Well, that was an exaggeration. It wasn't that much, but it still had that kind of sense. Well, when CETA bumped up against the Reagan administration, that was an interesting catfight too, because the new Secretary of Labor and the new Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training wanted to kill CETA entirely. Reader's Digest had done an article, you older folks will remember, called CETA is a four-letter word, and criticized it and all that kind of thing. Well, I feel good about the fact that though Senator Orrin Hatch from our state differs on an awful lot of things, that we in Utah were able to work upon him at a time when, instead of his present assignment as the head of the Committee on Judiciary Committee, he was then, of course, he was chairing the Committee on Labor and Labor and Human Resources, I guess it was called at that particular time. And he intervened and worked with the administration and got them to override the Secretary of Labor and replace CETA with JTPA, but at two costs. Two things disappeared. Public service employment disappeared, and stipends disappeared. So there was no more support for trainees while they were there. That meant that the only people who could be trained was those who could find somebody else to make it possible for them to eat, or who were on AFDC. So AFDC and recipients and people who had other employed people within their families who could pay for the rent and the food and so on while somebody's trained. Now, I don't think that didn't have something to do with these very short training durations and how quickly you dropped out and all of that. Well, let me come around to that. Where do we put the whole thing together under the Workforce Investment Act? You've got to find some way of providing subsistence. You've got to keep people in training long enough to get a family-sustaining earnings at the end, and you've got to intermingle remedial basic education and occupational skill training while you're at it. Now, where are you going to look around for that? One possibility that does a little bit, won't do the whole thing. You've done it, I'm sure. We've done it in our state, and that is to enroll people simultaneously in both JTPA and give them a Pell Grant, or vocational rehabilitation and a Pell Grant. One which could pay for the training, and the other which could provide a little money which could be used for subsistence purposes. Not adequate. The maximum for Pell Grant right now just raised to $3,750 a year. By the time you pay your tuition and books, you don't have much over. But if you get somebody else to pay your tuition and books, at least you've got $3,750 bucks, a little over $300 a month. You're not going to pay much rent and eat very hearty on that, but at least it help a bit. But that's something we really got to wrestle with if we're going to figure out some way of doing this. Now, I won't take time to go deeply into it, but let's also think about apprenticeship and realistic and real on-the-job training, and some kind of interaction so that maybe you spend some time in classroom skill training and adult basic education, get yourself a little preparation, then maybe go out on a job for a while and back, or get yourself into an apprenticeship or some kind of combination. But somehow we have to, in some realistic sense, have the public employment service people who are going to have the data about what are the jobs out there and where are the people who need the training, all those kind of things, and the education people, technical education as well as adult basic education, and vocational rehabilitation, and all of these in some kind of a combination that it seems to me Title V of the Workforce Investment Act gives us at least a shot at. And then we're going to have to set out for some long-term kind of activity with people. I've been interested in what President Bush has been saying about what we now call the faith-based community. We used to just go to church, but now you go to the faith-based whatever, so on. But in our state, one thing that we found very useful from those kind of organizations is something that I think is fairly critical as you think about a long-term process of involvement. And that's mentoring. If you're going to set people who have limited backgrounds, limited education, and we're going to run them down some long kind of track that's going to be at least a year's training and maybe longer, and they don't have a family support system, somebody to take them by the hand and help them all that, maybe that's an outlet for that kind of industry. But at any rate, what I'd like to discuss with you in the time that's left, let you come back to me at. Is there anything reasonable about what I said? And if there is, what are we really going to do in this field to make it possible to not only adequately take care of the first chance, preparing people to enter the labor market adequately prepared initially, but focusing here on what are we going to do about that second chance population that needs to be brought to the point of family sustaining earnings. Okay, tell me how to do it. Right there. Okay. So you're not disagreeing with it, you're just saying that we ought to spread down.
It probably did not get picked up by the video, so if you'd repeat the comment.
The comment was that Table 4, which shows the relationship between the training hours and the pay for the first job and the follow-up job, needs to be made known to every state's Workforce Investment Board. And may I say to you that every one of those, second chance for the fourth chance. That was because Steve and Andy and some of the rest of us had said, what do we call the one that preceded this? Toward a fourth chance for second chance programs, because we were saying, here's the first one we tried again. That's right. Here was MDTA and CETA and JTTA and now Workforce Investment. So we wrote one before the Workforce Investment Act was passed about what should your fourth chance look like. After it was passed, we wrote this called a second chance for the fourth chance. Every state and local workforce investment board has received that. Now, have they read it? That's a different question entirely, but they've at least received it. Thank you for that. Other comments? Yes.
Looking at table 4, even though longer-term training makes a difference, I'll point out later that it doesn't take too much about subsistence wages, which is the guts of this kind of thing. So I think the issue is really long-term training, of a serious sort. And there are all kinds of questions of keeping people in that training and so forth. I wonder if people thought about bonuses, the longer time you stay in training, to try to encourage people to stay in longer. And really starting to admit that piecemeal approaches won't do it. You really need a lot more money here. Your table results, sure, long-term training makes a difference for the white.
But not enough of a difference, or something. Okay, I'm going to write the word bonuses down here. Yes.
One of the critical problems it seems for current businesses and industries is getting enough trained personnel. Is there anything in the tax reduction, tax rebate legislation, whatever you call it, that would reward large businesses or industries for participating more in training? In other words, you get a greater tax break if you make a greater investment in training on people cleaning.
Well, I guess two things. One, I sure hope it remains true that it's tough to find workers, given all the current comment about the economic outlook. Two, there's nothing, of course, in the current Bush proposal, because that's purely personal income. But three, we've had in the last over the last 20 years, we've experimented with that under CETA and JTPA. It really never accomplished much. It may simply be that the tax credit was too small related to the qualifications that the people that you were trying to get the employer to employ. But there was experimentation with that, but very little result.
Apprenticeship is something that you speak about as a potential useful tool for the second chance population. But we don't invest in it. If you could be king for a day, what tactics would you suggest we consider using to strengthen the knowledge about and the use of that tool?
That's an interesting question. The executive dean of the part of the Salt Lake Community College, and I look at things, I guess, from where I live, but at any rate, I was just talking to him the other night. He runs almost all of the certificate, the non-degree stuff in the Salt Lake Community College. And he was telling me last week that 3 of his sons are electrical apprentices. He thought they had more prospect of getting into a good apprenticeship program than anything that he could do for them there on campus. They started out at $10 an hour, and they'll go up to about $20 to $24 an hour or something like that. If, of course, the employment stays the same as it is right now in the state of Utah, while we're preparing for the Winter Games 1 year from now. Will they still be employed in March of 2002? Well, that's another question. But that's something we wondered about all these years. Why don't more people take advantage of apprenticeship? And I've never found an adequate answer to that. Is anybody? Those are mighty plush jobs if you can end up starting out at that kind of pay, and that you're going to move on up through that, assuming that you're going to have reasonable levels of employment in those crafts. But you don't find that kind of pay very many places. What is the age of the average apprentice?
In Ohio, it's 28.
It is nationally, 28. When do you end up in apprenticeship? After you've tried everything else and fell flat on your face, and you get an opportunity for an apprenticeship, and you begin to think it's worthwhile and go on. But getting kids, when we were at the start of the discussion of the School to Work initiative, modeling on the German apprenticeship plan. How far did that get? It's disappeared, hasn't it? Somehow getting 18-year-old American kids to see the value of an apprenticeship hasn't been accomplished. And I wish I knew how to do it. But we certainly ought to do everything we can to sell the notion, because that's one of the best things going. Okay? Anybody else? Well, if there's nothing else, you're going to be rewarded with not having to listen to me for the last 30 minutes, and I'll be rewarded.
Sure, I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Garth, for your historical perspective you brought to these issues and the depth of the concern which you evidence in trying to use public policy to address these problems. I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much. We have some refreshments in the back. I hope you'll have a chance to enjoy those, and I'm sure Garth will be happy to take your questions one-on-one. Thank you.